Well, hello, everybody. This is Steve Rode, your friendly drone pilot. And with me is Robert, who is going to be doing the expert presentation today on aeronautical decision making. So, like always, if you can hear me, go into the chat tab. It's on the right side of your screen and just say, hey, we can hear you. And let us know we got that technology hurdle out of the way. All good. Okay.
And all
Sounding good.
good. All
Excellent.
right.
We can hear you. Thank you so much. It's always interesting because the one hurdle that we have whenever we use this webinar software is some people can't hear because they need to click on the screen where the presentation is and turn their microphone on. And those are the exact people right now who don't have a clue what I'm saying because they can't hear me. But today we're talking about aeronautical decision making and crew resource management or cockpit resource management. This is one of those areas where I think that a lot of new drone pilots have kind of been shortchanged on their education because people have gone out, taken the Part 107 exam, become a licensed, certificated FAA commercial pilots, and the FAA considers you to be a commercial pilot like the rest of the guy flying the big plane. And expects you to have some of the same skills and abilities. And one of those skills, if you look at the study material the FAA provides on aeronautical decision making, the chapter is 30 pages long. And on night flying, it's 10 pages long. So there's a whole bunch of information that nobody really got when they became Part 107 pilots. And let me tell you in advance, actually, let me clear up some housekeeping, which is for those who have not been here before, there are some tabs on the right side of the screen. Ken, Leon, Ted, Ed, Robert, Steve, and Stephen all discovered the chat tab there. And there's a questions tab where if you have a longer question that you want to ask during the presentation, you can type it there. At the end of the presentation, for those that can, hey, Mike, those that can, who are North Carolina public safety employees, I'm going to give you a link and you can get your free continuing education credits through the North Carolina Public Safety Drone Academy. And we'll give you our email addresses and everything. You can always reach out afterwards. And there's an online test. You have to score just like your Part 107, a 70% or better. And you'll get a fancy dancy little downloadable certificate that you passed the class and attended. And you can do whatever you want with that. That's your prerogative. The class should run about 30 minutes or so. And again, you can ask questions along the way, and I'll jump in and interrupt Robert during his presentation. But I want to tell you, I want to be dead honest with you that Robert, when did you become a private pilot?
1987.
Okay, so we became pilots just about the same time. And pilots never like to admit that they've made any sort of mistakes. We're always awesome and good.
Oh, no.
Perfect
Yes.
in every way. But I've got to tell you, being a pilot that long in an airplane and also a drone pilot since, I don't know, 2014 or something, I have made my share of mistakes. And I have two philosophies, which is number one, there's no sense wasting a perfectly good mistake. What can I learn from that incident, take away, and not do again? And the second one is, as stupid as I always thought the whole concept of aeronautical decision making was, and as abstract as it was when I had to learn it, it really provides you with some valuable skills for you to make good decisions as a pilot. Number one, protect the aircraft. Number two, protect people on the ground. But most importantly, number three, protect you from doing something stupid and incurring a bunch of liability. Everything that you're going to see today is either my opinion or Robert's opinion. We always reserve the right to be wrong, although we strive not to be. And I want to thank you so much for attending today on aeronautical decision making. Anything else, Robert, before you get going?
Boy, not that I can think of, Steve.
Okay. All right. I'm going to turn the stage over to you. I'm going to sit here and just monitor the chat and the questions tab.
Roger that. Thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone. When Steve and I decided to put together this seminar on aeronautical decision making and crew resource management. We basically put it together through an amalgamation of our experiences as manned aircraft pilots and also as drone pilots. And this presentation is really designed specifically for the Part 107 and UCOA pilots out there as well. And since it's rather new, what I'm trying to do is condense a whole raft of information into the areas that I think are important. So I'll be really curious to get your feedback to see what you think. And if I'm missing things or should maybe make some clarifications, whatever, definitely interested to hear from you all. Because when Steve and I talk, we really have one goal in all the webinars we're doing. And really our goal is to help you become efficient, competent pilots, and not just to do the minimum necessary to get by or to memorize answers to pass the test. So hopefully in that vein, you will see this presentation as helping contribute toward that objective or that goal. In terms of aeronautical decision making, often referred to as ADM, Crew Resource Management, CRM. Typically, if you look at the way the FAA defines this, you can go ahead and read that, but among our group, this kind of didn't do it for me. So I went about and designed something that I think will be a little more helpful than some arcane definitions. You know, how do you really apply it to the type of drone flying that you're doing? This all comes from the pilot handbook. And again, this is available online. I don't know how many pages there are in it, Steve, but there's hundreds. I mean, there is all kinds of information in the pilot's handbook of aeronautical knowledge. Most of what you see in the presentation has been lifted a little bit from the ADM part of it, along with personal experiences that Steve and I both had and corroborated to put together information we thought would be valuable. They also have a separate handbook on risk management if you decide to delve deeper into how to mitigate and reduce or eliminate risk as far as aviation. But again, this is really directed more towards manned aircraft as opposed to unmanned. So we want to take a stab at helping you all out there from a unmanned perspective. These are some of the things that are available from the FAA to determine whether or not you should fly. They have a variety of different forms, grids to help you decide whether or not you should be conducting the flight or not. Again, a lot of these I personally don't use, but I present those to you just to let you know that there are some resources out there should you decide to kind of want to take a look at that. In terms of checklists, Steve and I have gone through, there's a number of them. One called PAVE, Pilot Aircraft Environment Equipment, called CARE, Consequences, Alternatives, Reality, External Factors, TEAM, Transfer, Eliminate, Accept, Mitigate, Decide, Detect, Estimate, Choose, Identify, Do, Evaluate, and Steve's favorite is I Am Safe, which is
that's what I was going to chime in and say. I'm Safe is my favorite one.
Well, I beat you to it, so
yeah, thank you.
Take that. Okay, well, and having been a single pilot IFR driver a long time, my goal is to try and simplify workload so I could really spend my time on doing what I thought was best to make sure that the flight was conducted safely and I could land with the aircraft in the same shape it was when it took off. So basically, to start off with, I know that in talking with Steve, a lot of you COA pilots and 107 pilots are faced with some rather daunting decisions from maybe the incident commander or the chief of operations out there, whatever. And I wanted to share this with you early on, is that these are hazardous attitudes that I invite you to consider to avoid. And typically with incident commanders, they want it done now. Well, what if it's not safe to conduct the flight? As the sole and final responsibility for the flight as the PIC, it is incumbent on you to refuse to fly if you think it's unsafe, regardless of what the incident commander says. And here's some other attitudes as far as anti-authority that you may run into, or invulnerability. Machoism basically means you show off. And resignation, this is one that we try as man pilots to completely remove from a vocabulary. Point is, we will never give up. We'll do whatever it takes to bring it down safely and do the best we can. And then also to remind you that part 91.3 and 13 Those are the areas that we're responsible for. We're the ultimate responsibility, and we could be potentially cited for careless and reckless flying if we maybe submit to the incident commander and fly something where perhaps we shouldn't. Steve,
So
you have any comment on
I'm
that?
going to jump in here for just a second.
Please.
There's a famous pilot, Bob Hoover, and
Okay.
Bob had a saying which was, "You need to be able to fly the aircraft as far into the accident as possible." And it's that whole resignation attitude that when things are not going right for you with the drone, you can't just give up. You have to be a pilot to the very end. And these hazardous attitudes, this anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, machoism, resignation, these really hit home for me on an incident scene, because it seems that a lot of firefighters and police officers and are type A personalities, and nobody wants to admit when they're making a mistake. You don't have to admit it out loud, but at least know it in your head.
Fair enough. I think it's a good point, Steve, especially with your experience in that area. What I decided to do in preparing for this webinar is to try and come up with something that I thought UCOA and 107 pilots could really use to help determine all the aspects of the flight to determine whether or not it should be flown. And that's what I came up with, WE-AFD, and that stands for Weather, Environment, Aircraft, Flight Crew, and Communications and Documentation. One of the things that Steve and I have been very fortunate to become manned aircraft pilots is that, in getting our instrument rating, I had somewhat a respect for nature, obviously, when you go through hailstorms and thunderstorms and whatnot. But when it came to instrument flying, I gained a very, very healthy respect and appreciation for weather, because flying is all about weather. In terms of us COA and 107 pilots, wind is critical. We actually flew a mission where we were flying in winds 12 gusting to 23, which is right at the limits of the ship. Fortunately, I pulled the weather strips prior to that gig, and they were forecast to become worse. And actually, when we were on site, we were able to get a couple flights in. We could literally command complete right stick of the drone, and it just sat there. It wasn't moving any place. So once the wind started picking up, I terminated the flight, and we said, hey, we're going to take what we have, see if the client is happy with it. And if they're not, we'll have to reschedule another time. So wind is definitely a big factor, because wind can override the capabilities of the aircraft. In terms of temperature, this is something we also need to keep track of, because those of you down south that have flown in very hot weather, your batteries can overheat and they can spontaneously combust. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll bring maybe some coolers along and some plastic bags. So if the batteries get hot, we can actually put them in a cooler to cool them off, such that we can recharge them again and reuse them. Up in the northern regions, we have an opposite problem, because when we're flying in weather that's freezing or a tad bit below, our challenge is the exact opposite. The aircrafts perform beautifully, but unfortunately the batteries do not. So we're out there with hair dryers or hand warmers or anything we can get our hands on to keep these batteries warmed up prior to flight. And of course, as you could well imagine, the battery power falls off in cold weather. And a lot of times we'll get false indications that we have 40% battery left, and within flight, they'll start to fall out of the sky. So temperature can be very important as far as battery life, both in terms of the battery in the ship, the batteries in the display you're using, and the batteries in the control units that you have as well. They all come into play. Visibility. Obviously, there are certain visibility restrictions that we have to abide by. A lot of times drone pilots ask me, why do we have 500 feet below, 2,000 feet lateral, and there's actually one for 1,000 feet above clouds? And the reason for that is if there's any manned IFR traffic, instrument flight rules traffic, coming through the clouds, they give the instrument pilots a bit of room to try and spot traffic once they break out of the clouds. Now, I don't know if any of you have been up in a general aviation aircraft, but I dare you to find a Mavic if you're coming out of altitude. When we fly Mavics 400 feet, we have trouble, finding it in the air. So there's just no way a manned aircraft pilot is going to find any kind of drone. So the point is that it's our responsibility as drone pilots to make sure that our aircraft is well away from any manned operation, whether it's a rotorcraft, helicopter, manned aircraft, etc.
All right, I'm going to chime in again. when you're down on the ground and we're flying our UAS and we're looking up at the sky and a helicopter is coming through, a news helicopter or something, it is very easy to spot against the sky. One of the things that I've been doing is taking up in the airplane. For anybody who wants to come to Raleigh, North Carolina, we'll go flying in the airplane and I'll give you the perspective of what it's like looking from the top down. And forget seeing drones. I mean, it's a hard enough time seeing another plane at 4 miles. It's the rule has always been it's a big sky, and so we didn't worry about hitting much. But when we have drone pilots out there who are not aware that, especially helicopters, in an incident situation, can operate as low as 200 feet. There can quickly become some serious consequences. At the North Carolina Drone Summit that just went on this week, one of the panels that I moderated, we had Lieutenant Colonel Pickett from the North Carolina National Guard, who explained that last year in the flooding disasters that we had where drones were flying, that there were drone pilots who were totally unaware that when the Coast Guard helicopters were coming in and doing manned lifts of rescuing people and operating at 200 feet, that the drone pilots just didn't think that they were going to be flying that low. So you always have to be watching out.
Agreed. A lot of times if we're flying in an area where they have medevac copters, Steve, will actually check in with the chief pilot there and get on frequency just so we can monitor if there's any emergency situations where we can actually bring ourselves out of the air, put it on the ground until the helicopter is passed. In terms of precipitation, obviously we tend to avoid precipitation. We actually did some testing with some of our drones and flew in some rainstorms. And they actually performed fairly well until, guess what happened? You know, the battery compartment filled up with water and things kind of went south in a hurry. In terms of clouds, obviously we want to avoid those at all costs, because part of our responsibility as PIC is we have to maintain VLOS, visual line of sight. In terms of where do you get weather information, obviously TAF, Terminal Aerodrome Forecasts, or MEDARs, Meteorological Aviation Reports, are available online that many of you probably have access to, and I have a couple examples here I'll show you in a minute. Part of the challenge is obviously Zulu time. That's the way they produce these particular weather strips, and I'll show you kind of some ways to deal with that. Here's a strip that basically is a terminal aerodrome forecast, and you can see it's somewhat arcane. And a lot of those who have not really studied for the test, I mean, you look at this and it's all Greek. And to be perfectly honest, I was talking to Steve, I said, if I get older, I look at this and I go, oh man, I need some help here. How do I do that? Well, the good news is that through certain applications, and this is something I learned from Albert Einstein, never memorize something that you can look up. So what you can actually do is go online and it will translate the information for you so it's much more readable. And this way you can also use it maybe to kind of test your skills when you look at the previous strip to say, hey, can I decode this even on my own without this particular application that will allow it to translate it so I can actually interpret what's happening with the weather a lot more easily. And what I usually do when I fly a gig is I will actually print this out and bring it on along with me in my logbook, such that in case I ever get ramp checked and maybe the FAA investigator says, well, did you check weather? And I say, yeah, here's the strip I've got. If you notice here between 10 o'clock local time and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I've got these sorts of winds, looks like it's clear, I'm safe to fly. So again, additional documentation you can use to support the reason you're there at all. In terms of conversion, obviously you use Greenwich Mean Time. For us people in the central time zone, we subtract 6 hours in standard, 5 hours, right now during daylight time to get to local. But the good news is that you can actually make yourself a little chart. So you can say, okay, here's what the Zulu time is. So therefore, if I'm in a different region, here's where I can interpret the weather strip if I, look at it carefully. And there's actually an application where you can get on your smartphone, whatever, that will actually do the conversion for you as well. So the point is that there are tools out there to help you decipher the weather accurately so you can make some good informed decisions. In terms of weather, obviously, many of you have applications with weather radar to help you get an idea of, some potential storms coming in. Maybe the incident commander says, hey, I want you to launch. You say, well, this is what I'm looking at. I don't think I want to go up right now. Why don't we wait this out until it passes, and then we'll kind of talk later. In terms of air masses, here's kind of a little cheat sheet that I use to kind of give me an idea of what am I up against. And you can see there's stable and unstable air. Some of the criteria for all the different air masses, we won't go through this, but what I can do is make this available to Steve so he can get it out to you folks to give you an idea of what you should expect. And I think that the thing that's really interesting is that when I was studying for my private and commercial tests, when I looked at stable air, the one mistake I made is I figured stable air would be good visibility, and it's not. Typically, stable air is very poor visibility, where it shows here where fog may occur. But the unstable air, obviously, a lot of those common sense will tell you, gee, it's typically the lapse rate. In other words, the change in temperature going up changes very steeply. Cumulus, which is typically your thunderstorm type clouds. We expect showers, gusty winds, turbulence, all the things that you and I would associate with unstable air. What's interesting is that typically in unstable air, we have very good visibility, which is kind of interesting. So kind of file that away in your archives and library. In terms of environment, and Steve and I spoke a little bit earlier today before we talked about this, one of the things that I'm constantly looking for before I take off is, are there any obstructions or ground hazards that I need to take, account for? Maybe buildings or antennas. EMI, electromagnetic interference, or RF, radio frequency interference, is something that we're always keeping an eye on. We actually flew an engagement one time. We're on the roof of a building, and we were trying to do some different shots, to gain some different perspective. And on top of that building, they had a lot of equipment that was pushing off either EMI, RF, or both. And what was interesting, when we were flying, like my partner was flying at the time, the drone started departing. And I said, hey, Bruce, is that the direction, you're planning on going? And he says, holy cow, no, not at all. And so fortunately, we were able to recover the drone without incident. Then we obviously landed, moved to a different spot where the EMI RF was not an interference. Terrain, population, obviously very important, because we cannot fly over people except for us co-pilots on a momentary basis, not always. And airspace, which we'll talk about in a minute. And some of the operation limitations you may want to set for your flight, I won't go through a lot of these, but just to give you an idea, we have to maintain VLOS. Our visibility needs to be 3 statute miles from control station's location. We've already talked about, the distance from clouds. You're familiar with the 400-foot AGL limit, except when you're inspecting towers, because we have a limit within a 400-foot radius of that structure to go up to the height of the tower plus 400 feet more, and do that unless we're penetrating class airspace, in which case we need a COA to do so. We don't want to interfere with any operations in any airport, and we've already talked about the momentary operations over people. Here's a little pictorial to give you an idea of where we can fly drones safely in class airspace. I won't get into a lot of detail on that. Perhaps we could cover that another time, but at least give you an idea of what you may be up against, again, to fly safely and keep yourself out of trouble. This is a sectional where you can also get an indication of what type of class airspace that you're into. As you can see here, this is MSP, and which is Class B airspace. And then we have South St. Paul in there. We have Lake Elmo, which is where I fly out of, and several others in the chart here to give you an idea of where you'll start violating class airspace. Here's an example of a temporary flight restriction, and this could be whether the president or some senior official is going into an area, and typically it's a 30-mile radius around that. So those are something to keep track of, because obviously you don't want to penetrate TFRs without previous clearance. And what was interesting is I actually had the opportunity one time, as I was flying back into Lake Elmo, there was a TFR at MSP. President was on site. I was on an IFR flight plan, and they allowed me to land at Lake Elmo, which is within the TFR veil, But one of the things I had to do is maintain constant communication during the termination part of the flight. And once I was on the ground, radio to them that I'm on the ground and clear, and everything was fine. They were happy. I was happy. I was able to get home and didn't have to land someplace else and rent a car and bring the aircraft home another time. In terms of the low altitude authorization navigation capability, the LANC system, this is something you can also use to get an idea of where you can fly legally. And what I'll do is zoom in on one here, and what you can see is the different numbers on there. What those indicate is the AGL limits of that particular region. So if I'll zoom in a little more here, you'll notice the 0 means all the way to the ground. So in order for me to fly at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, I'm going to need a COA even just to, stand on that ground and lift off. Where you see the 100, they're basically allowing me a clearance up to 100 feet. The 400 is AGL up to 400. So here's another tool you can use to make sure that you're not violating any airspace restrictions, that the FAA has already designated. In terms of a DJI unlock request, this is actually a recent flight that we did. This was at the Anoka County Airport, and you can see the veil around there. It is a class airport, so we needed to file a certificate of authorization to fly that. And what they're also doing now is you'll see the corridors for runway 27 and 9, and they also have some for 18 and 0 or 36. Where they're actually showing us drone pilots. Here are the departure and landing and takeoff areas for the airport that we want to make sure you stay clear of. So what we did is we basically filed with them, and I don't have the closer one, but we actually, that little purple dot there you can see is actually where the structures we were inspecting. So we basically contacted Tower. They gave us clearance once we filed our certificate of authorization, which they had on their strip, allowed us to fly, and we kept communication with them, told them what was happening. If there's any aircraft in the area, let us know, and we'll move out of the way. But fortunately, our altitude was only 200 feet AGL, and in most cases, the aircraft in that vicinity were going to be 800 to 1,000 feet. So the chances of us running into an aircraft is, 0. But the Tower was very appreciative because we were communicating with them as to our intentions. And that way, if there was any anomalies, they could notify us, and we'd be happy to pull ourselves out of the air. In terms of aircraft, pre-flight checklist is something that we as manned aircraft use constantly. We'd recommend that you, COA, and 107 pilots do the same as well. And the idea there is not only to make sure the aircraft is airworthy and safe to fly, but there are software updates. You have to charge batteries. You need to look if there's any cracks in the hull or dings in the props. You want to check control links. One of the things we do as part of our checklist is when we lift off, we just don't fly. We actually go up to about 10 feet and we test all the controls, the yaw, pitch, and, gaining altitude, just to make sure that the ship is within our control. And once we're satisfied that everything seems to be working fine, then we go ahead and, execute the flight. We also do a hover test where we actually let it sit there for a while for two reasons. Number one, we want to make sure, do we have good GPS positioning where the ship is actually maintaining a hover? And number two, are the winds such that we may be having problems, in which case we may land and abort the flight. And we have done that previously where we said, I'm just not real happy with the way the winds are treating us here. Let's scrub the flight. And this happens a lot if you're doing anything in between buildings, because you have that Venturi effect where maybe you're looking at 8 to 12 miles an hour. Oh, that's pretty good. But then all of a sudden that wind starts, increasing between buildings, and it can make, flying within structures like that very, challenging and hazardous. In terms of RF EMI interference, we've talked about that. Again, we're constantly looking for in our kind of our pre-flight checking. So when we take it up around a building, if we see antennas, we'll actually fly up to that altitude and say, okay, do we still have control of our ship or not? Or if things started getting flaky to where, okay, we either need to mend it or we need to actually terminate our flight to make sure we don't encounter any obstructions. In terms of flight crew, one of the policies that we implement is we always have a visual observer. You have the remote pilot in command, the remote person manipulating controls. But as a pilot, I always like to have that second set of eyes, helping me out as to, am I getting close to trees or power lines or an antenna? Are there migratory birds in the area that may, decide to attack my ship? Because we do have quite a population of bald eagles in the area here. And believe me, they have no reservation about taking anything out of the air. In terms of flight crew, we get involved in mission planning, briefing. The other thing I want to talk about is a little bit about fit to fly, because a lot of times, as you know, as a pilot, it's 8 hours bottle to throttle. We can't blow 0.4 or better as far as alcohol content, but that also includes medication. And there have been times when, as a PIC, if your VO is not up to par, it is your responsibility to remove them from the flight crew and perhaps, brief one other person who can substitute for them, because that is part of our responsibility. VOs are subjected to the same criteria that we are, can't be intoxicated, can't be heavily medicated, that kind of thing, because their responsibility as far as helping the PIC is really important, and we are responsible for them as well. We also talk about communications, and sometimes Steve talked in an earlier webinar about, full duplex radios, which work really well if they're line of sight. We find if we somewhat disappear and we positioned ourselves differently, we've actually had to revert to cell phones. And we find those, if you have good cell towers in the area, to be very effective. Otherwise, you're looking at probably stronger radios that can work around, don't have, the particular line of sight involved. Emergency procedures, we also want to talk about, okay, if we run into this, what are we going to do? And we want to talk about, and this is part of the pre-flight planning, we want to look at not only the FAA class airspace, but there may be state and local laws concerning trespassing where they don't allow drone flights. There's actually a city across the river from us in Hudson where they've actually passed an ordinance where they say drone flights are not allowed. Well, we have to respect that. The FAA says you're good from our standpoint, but the city over there says, well, you're not from ours, so we have to get special permission if we choose to fly there. So some things you need to keep aware of as you're looking at, flying in different areas. We've kind of talked about these attitudes before. I just wanted to repost them again. The point is that you're in control of the situation. If you do not feel comfortable, if you're getting a lot of pressure from people to fly and you start to feel your stomach maybe tighten up or, that sort of thing, I encourage you to say, look, I'm just not comfortable doing this right now. I don't need the pressure because, as you know, sometimes flying, at night or in inclement conditions is very stressful. And Steve and I, and I'm sure a lot of you out there have, that, it's just not worth it. There's too much that can go wrong, and you need to pay attention to flying the aircraft and doing it well. In terms of emergency procedures, a lot of times, do you have, procedures in place for loss of control link, loss of GPS? Can you fly it without GPS, like in the ADM mode or in the manual mode? Battery fires. I mean, hopefully you won't experience that. But if you do, if you start seeing, things smoke, bring that thing down right away, because you don't want that thing ending up someplace where it could really create a problem. Collisions, obviously avoiding any, migratory waterfowl or birds or anything like that, because we actually have to report on that. Flyaways, how are we going to take care of that? Do we have procedures to do that? In terms of documentation, a lot of times that I'll actually bring along with me in case I get ramp checked is my certificates, insurance or aircraft registration, any codes or COWs. And in my logbooks, I have all my maintenance, repair, batteries, updates, etc., along with an ops manual. And as I indicated before, I bring along my TAF meter printouts to indicate to them that, yeah, I have checked weather prior to, executing the flight. And the last one I've got in terms of NTSB reporting, a lot of people have asked me, well, what happens if somebody gets hurt? Well, if you see here, if it's minor or moderate, which is superficial, or it's a reversible injury, but medical attention is required. In other words, somebody got bumped a little bit, but it's not a big deal. We don't have to file anything. However, anything from serious down to unsurvivable, we do, plus any loss of consciousness. So here's kind of a little sheet to let you know if somebody gets hurt, here's what you need to file and when you need to file with the NTSB if that happens. Oh, that was a quick one, Steve. I got a lot more information I'd like to share, but
let me jump in. So aeronautical decision making from the FAA point of view is a systematic approach to making good decisions in difficult situations. And as Robert said, there are a number of different ways to do that. He introduced some of the checklists very quickly, but we need to keep in mind that some times of our flight, which are generally when we take off or we're coming back and we're tired, are easy to make bad decisions. Before I take off, I'm the big fan of the I'm safe checklist. So I actually mentally run through this checklist. And I is for illness. Am I ill? Am I sick? Is there anything that would reduce my performance? M is for medication. Am I taking something right now where I wouldn't be able to make good decisions? The next one is stress. And stress in the I'm safe, it's the S, but that is, I don't know, it seems to be included in every incident that we're called to. Am I under a lot of stress, either my personal life, professional life, the flying, the weather? Is it creating a stressful environment that wouldn't make it safe to fly? Alcohol. Alcohol is interesting because while our blood alcohol content shouldn't be more than 0.04%, the FAA also says that you should not fly if you have consumed any alcohol within 8 hours. It doesn't mean you had a glass, you had a bottle. It says any alcohol. So I think about, have I had anything to drink? F is for fatigue, and I'm safe. Fatigue is very important. Texas A&M just recently came out with a study that talked about the impact of fatigue on us drone pilots. And after a day of stressful flying, you can have the same limitations as if you are drunk. And so you have to be able to say no to flying if you're tired. And that comes down to especially COA pilots. If you are flying under a COA, your COA organization has a requirement, a duty to define flight schedules, duty times, and to minimize fatigue. And there should be an ongoing list about how many hours you've worked before you've flown. The FAA is going to be looking for that. And E, of course, is emotion. So is there something going on? Is this an event that is disturbing to me, that would create emotions that would not make it safe for me to fly? I am never afraid to say that I should not fly in any situation. If it's not a good situation, the events aren't there, then I will say no. And I have refused flights before, and you should not be afraid to. It's difficult sometimes talking to your commander or your chief or the incident commander and saying, I can't fly. But the FAA is requiring you as commercial pilots to make good decisions about keeping the drone on the ground, because gravity always wins, right? The drone is going to come down if you're not making good decisions.
Yeah,
So,
takeoffs are optional, landings are mandatory, right?
yes, right.
And maybe to add to what you say, Steve, I think illness, medication, and alcohol is pretty self-evident, but I agree with you as far as stress, fatigue, and emotion. When I think back on, some manned aircraft flights, I have canceled flights where I felt stressed. I've canceled flights when I felt fatigue, and I canceled flights when emotionally I didn't think I was right. And I said, I'm just not going to risk it. And so I would encourage, the COA and 107 pilots out there, really consider doing the same.
So the FAA has one of the things is this whole risk management process, and it's something on the ground. One of our battalion chiefs has a saying, and I totally agree on it, which is, do something, take a breath. Do something, take a breath. And slow is generally faster, where you're not rushing to make decisions. The FAA has this chart in risk management, which is you identify the hazard, you assess the risks, you analyze what you can do about it, you make the input, you monitor the results. So you're not rushing to make decisions. In fact, with new pilots, when I put them in an unusual situation, the first thing that I see people do is start moving the controls. And the best thing that you can do is stop, take a breath, think it through. The drone will hover exactly where you leave it. So you don't need to be in a rush to do anything in particular. Rushing can lead to serious consequences. This is a chart that the FAA, it seems like it's on every test that I take, both manned and unmanned. It's the 5 hazardous attitudes. And anti-authority, which is don't tell me what to do. I think we've all run into all of these types. But the antidote that is usually on your FAA test, the antidotes they want to hear you say that in the anti-authority situation, your response as a pilot should be to follow the rules because the rules are generally right and will protect you. In an impulsivity situation, do it quickly. I want you to do this now. The right response for that is not so fast, think first, and just remember that battalion chief wisdom. Do something, take a breath. Do something, take a breath. You don't have to be in a rush. Invulnerability. None of us are invulnerable. When we're flying the aircraft, between the weather, the incident, the people walking into your incident scene, the all the uncertainties about the software, the hardware, the motors, everything else, you are not invulnerable. This is always about managing risk. And while the invulnerability attitude is it won't happen to me, the reality is it sure can happen to me. So you have to fly defensively. Macho, I can do it. What do you need me to do, boss? I'll be in there. I'll do it. I had a team tell me recently that they were so fatigued and worn out from all the flights that they were asked to fly that they just couldn't do anymore. And the answer to that is they needed to say no a long time ago and assess which flights they had the best chance of having a successful input on. Don't fly to fly. Fly not because you can do it, but because it is the right application of the aircraft in that situation, and it's going to generate actionable results. Don't fly to fly. FAA position on this is taking chances is foolish. And the last of the 5 hazardous attitudes is resignation. We talked about this before. What's the use? I give up. Fly the aircraft as far into the scene of the accident as possible. The FAA has a concept when you're out flying that they want you to mentally think about a final termination point, an FTP. If I'm on this scene, where am I going to ditch this aircraft? It's one of the things I quickly look around and think as I'm flying and I'm looking at the screen, if something happens, where am I going to ditch it? And I did have a flight where I came within a millimeter of crashing the aircraft. So it was, I fly a Matrice 210. It's a heavy aircraft. I can fly up into about 40, 45 mile an hour winds. It was a windy day, 35, 40 miles an hour, commercial structure fire. I was near a cell phone antenna. I don't know exactly what caused it, but I had a flyaway, lost total control. Thing took off 40 miles an hour. And I only had a few seconds to keep an eye on this thing. And as it went over a road, over a Wendy's, and it was headed towards a neighborhood, I gained just enough control at that point where I started to descend it rapidly, and I was going to ditch it into the trees that were there. So you always need to think about a place to ditch it. This story has a good outcome that I did save it right before it hit the trees and flew it back slowly and maintained control and landed it and went home. So
That's stress.
yeah, you can never resign yourself that it's hopeless. Fly it as far into the scene of the accident as possible. And then I think finally that you are the ultimate decision maker. You are the pilot. You have the personal liability. Even if you're flying for a department, if you have an accident and you land and hit somebody or damage property, you personally will be sued or can be sued. And so you should never fly thinking that you have the invisibility protection of liability. You don't. And that concludes my rambling here. I did post in the chat section the whole stable versus unstable air slide that you had. We have a post in the poll section about what classes I have. Next Wednesday, I'm doing Visual Observer. The following Wednesday, I'm doing thermal camera operations. You can go to psflight.org, register for those classes. They're free. Let me send you some links here. We have something in the chat tab. Quentin says, wow. Yeah, I got video of that too. I'll have to share it next time. So here,
Okay, and I was going to comment on Reeves then too, Steve. He says we almost had to shoot a UAV down to clear for the air for the flight to life to land. And I say, Reyes, look at Cosby versus, or Boggs versus Meredith. That was an infamous case where Meredith shot the drone out of the air. I think it was in Texas or in Kentucky. I said that would be very interesting because don't forget drones are FAA certified aircraft. So it's like shooting down a 747. So even though, was that case was really interesting. Actually, Meredith prevailed, because the drone was spying on his daughter. So, poor Boggs was out a Phantom 3 or 4, whatever he was flying. It was interesting.
Quentin says he did not know about being personally sued. So Robert mentioned the Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3. You as the pilot, if you're a COA pilot and you don't have a Part 107 and your operation is found to be not a public aircraft operation, as most non-incident operation flights are, then it would revert to your Part 107 status. If you don't have a Part 107, you are an unlicensed pilot. You're sued, you lose. If you are a Part 107 pilot, then you are eligible for the AOPA has the legal plan Pilot Protection Services. I'm a member of AOPA. In full disclaimer, I write for AOPA, but I am a proud Pilot Protection Services member. I think it's about $180 a year or something like that. And it gives you access, instant access. You can make a phone call. You can speak to an aviation attorney. They will help defend you and represent you in case you're sued. And I cannot recommend it enough. So AOPA.org, search for Pilot Protection Services.
Steve, I think that also applies if you're found to have flown a non-qualified mission too, as well.
Yeah, you're just not, as a COA pilot, you're just not eligible for coverage from AOPA because
Exactly.
COA pilots don't have any demonstrable skill level that they've passed. Since the agency has taken on the authority of self-certifying pilots, they have not passed any FAA test.
Right, and if they find out that if the inspector says, well, this is a not qualified mission, they actually revert back to civil, which is Part 107, which is all the accoutrements that they can apply. Amazing.
So Quentin says, so the city having insurance does not protect you when you're flying for the city. Absolutely not. If you are flying in the national airspace, you FAR 91.3, you are solely and ultimately responsible for the operation of that aircraft. Nobody can protect you from that. The city may get sued as well, but if you are the pilot in command, the sole responsibility rests on you, FAR 91.3.
And I think in some cases, don't they have an aviation exclusion in those insurance policies too, Steve?
I don't know. I just know that I know how the modern legal system works, and it's going to be a shotgun lawsuit, and everybody's going to be named. And the city, Reyes says, under a COA, I thought you were. Absolutely not.
No.
My personal opinion is we also do this COA thing, COA class, and flying under a COA, this is just going to be my personal opinion, and people are not going to like it. It's probably the worst thing to say before I say anything. But flying under a COA is the most insane thing that I can think of doing. I would personally never, ever do it based on what I know now, which is a COA is the transfer of authority from the FAA to an entity to conduct flight operations, training, everything to the same level that the FAA requires of Part 107 pilots. Yet the entities that take on the COA have no experience and don't know what they're doing. So the safest way absolutely to fly is always as a Part 107 pilot. Even if you're flying for an agency that has a COA, you should still be a Part 107 pilot. I was encouraged this year at the North Carolina Drone Summit. So we had agencies from all across primarily the East Coast, some from across the world, who the ones in the U.S. were now saying, we have a COA, but we require all of our pilots to be Part 107, which, thank goodness. The other thing about a COA is you don't need one to fly at night. I mean, in other classes, I've talked about how you can get an instant approval for night flight as a Part 107. You don't need a COA to fly in controlled airspace. Again, you can get an instant approval, or you can have a prior relationship, or you can have a waiver for airspace that you normally fly in. You don't need a COA for that. You don't need a COA to temporarily fly over people. Again, you can call the special DC hotline number, and you can get a one-time waiver for a particular incident. So there's no reason to fly under a COA. COAs give you more restriction about flying near airports, more reporting. And the big thing about COAs now is that all actions under a COA are accessible through open records or Freedom of Information Act requests. And departments are having to expose all of their pilots, all of their operations, all the parts they've flown. And I don't get it. But I posted the link to the continuing education credits for North Carolina folks. I am going to okay, so I am going to just look. Hey, Robert, can you look through do you have the test there quickly in front of you?
The test? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, just take a quick look through it and see if there's anything that we need to touch on again. Make sure we didn't race through it too fast so we can give them.
Let's see.
Okay, so I want to answer a couple of you do that. I'm going to answer 2 questions for Jim and Reyes. Okay, Jim, let me get my phone here. If you go to the FAA website and you do a search for UAS and emergency, you will find the page there for special governmental, whatever it is. It's drone emergency flights. But I talk about this in one of my classes. Here we go. This is the telephone number. So this applies to public safety pilots. So if you have a special situation where you do not have a waiver to fly, you can call the DC hotline number. And I encourage you to go to the FAA website, look up this information, because there's a form. They're going to want the information that's on the form. And if you have that handy, it'll go much faster. But I have never been rejected for a special request. They've been approved in 5 minutes or less. The 24-hour hotline number is 202-267-8276. This is the telephone number that you call to speak to an FAA representative to get an emergency waiver, one-time waiver. Quentin pasted the link there. Thank you. One-time waiver for an operation, and it can be beyond visual line of sight, over people, night flight, and I think there might be one more. But a one-time waiver that is connected with your Part 107 certificate, and it'll give you the authority to do anything. Yeah, I noticed that. Quentin said, whoops, take out the spaces. Hey, Quentin, can you repaste that without the spaces in there? So Reyes says all 5 operators at our department fly under 107 and have night operations waivers. We found ourselves with not enough trained VOs for night flight. So here's the big thing. I don't know why a night waiver is called a daytime waiver, but
FAA, so right?
I have a daytime waiver myself, although I'm not going to renew it. And here's why. The current daytime waivers that are being issued by the FAA have, as part of their requirements, item number 10, which says that your entire flight operations area at night must be illuminated. And there's no way that we can do that on an emergency scene with an incident. We're not going to be able to illuminate the entire scene. Or it says you have to go out in advance during the daylight and you have to have a reconnaissance of your total flight area. And we don't know where incidents are going to occur. So my personal opinion is the best thing to do is not worry about the daytime waiver, but to get very comfortable with calling that DC number, be a very professional pilot, and you will get the waiver that you need. The other thing that you said, Reyes, which was we found ourselves with not enough trained VOs for night operations. So here is the key for Part 107 pilots. Part 107 pilots are not required to have visual observers. While under a COA, you are generally always required to have a visual observer. So more flexibility with Part 107. And Quentin, thank you, went and posted that link. That if you, in the chat tab, if you click on that link, I'm going to click on it, open it in a new window. Page not found. Oh, FAA. UAS emergency situations. Here it is. Yep.
Great. And while you're doing that, Steve, I'd like to comment on Reyes's things. Not having enough VOs. I don't know about you, but flying at night, having a VO there is, to me, mandatory.
Yeah, I wish I don't, as the fire department pilot, I don't always have the luxury of having somebody there for me. So I just
if you can have it, it's invaluable.
They just changed the link a little bit, so I reposted it there. There is on that page, there is a link to the emergency operation request form, and that is the form I would print out now. I'd fill it out. I'd keep it with you because those are all the questions that they're going to ask you when you call them on the emergency number. I'm not giving you any slack for the hyphen. But thank you for watching this webinar on your phone. I appreciate that. Bonus points. I think that's it. Anything that you wanted to cover again on your test before we send them off to the test?
Boy, I think it looks good, Steve.
Okay. Awesome. Let me send you I posted Robert's email address and my email address, and you've got that there. Is there anything else? Nope. And this is the link to go take the. Oops.
We'll take the poll. Maybe let us know how we did.
Yeah, in the polls tab, there's a poll about what classes you'd like to see up and coming, and give us some feedback there. But here is the link to go take the test. The test. If you don't pass it, it'll loop you back around. You need to get 70% or better. It is a good tool to use as a secondary training tool. If you don't pass something, that's the way I learn the best. And
Leon made a comment that's kind of the rules we abide by too, Leon, is that we always pair a VO with a PIC. I think that's a good practice if you can pull that off.
So Definitely. Here at the fire department and also with the police department, the problem is just responding to an incident. So oftentimes so we never use a firefighter or somebody else at the scene that already has another job because it's easy for that person to become distracted. And so you need a visual observer that is totally focused on you. Of the times that I have flown in an emergency, these are emergency incident flights, I'd say 10% of the time I've had a visual observer, what I would call a technical visual observer. 90% of the time, what I do as a pilot is I start recruiting and training people in the field. So I will grab somebody who is standing there and wants to gawk. And your task is traffic. I want you to let me know if you see anybody come down that street. Your task is to let me know if you see anybody walking up behind me. Your task is to watch this. So I'm all about assigning people, but just for me, from my flying that I do in public safety, trying to get somebody else who's trained in an emergency incident that is unfolding right now is a very difficult process.
Tough. A fair point.
All right. Any more questions for the chat tab, or you got the polls tab there? Vote on what classes you'd like to see, and I'll shut up and stop talking. Reyes says we have one operator on each of the 4 teams with one coordinator overseeing the program. It's a night deployment. We need to call in someone. The other thing you can do too is You can just train everybody on your department, run through a visual observer class and certify them. You can do that as the Part 107 pilot. Next Wednesday, I am teaching the visual observer train the trainer class, and then everybody in your department, you can grab one person and they are a qualified visual observer. All right. Adios.
Thanks, everyone.